Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the really fascinating intellectual and journalistic foundations of modern Nigeria. When we look at how nations are built, we usually focus on the battles, right? The ones fought with guns and artillery. But what if I told you the absolute most powerful weapons used to build the most populous country in Africa were actually the printing press and a radical new political philosophy? Today, we're unpacking the origins of modern Nigeria. We'll be moving all the way from the fiery newspaper columns of the 1930s right up to the devastating collapse of the First Republic in the 1960s. Now, to really grasp the complex history of Nigeria, and that includes the profound tragedy of its civil war, we absolutely have to follow this incredible Igbo proverb, famously quoted by the novelist Chinua Achebe. A man who does not know where the rain began to beat him cannot say where he dried his body. We literally have to trace the intellectual rainstorms that birthed the nation. We can't just start the story when the conflict breaks out, right? We have to look at the climate that actually created it. So the crucial takeaway here is that visionary journalism and really powerful political ideologies laid the foundation for Nigeria's independence. But at the exact same time, they embedded the immense complexities that shaped its later conflicts. It's kind of wild, but the very same tools used to unite a massive group of people against colonial rule inadvertently highlighted the regional fractures that would later threaten to tear the whole new nation apart. Okay, here's our roadmap for the explainer today. Weapons of the pen, the ideology of Zikism, forging a political movement, the First Republic, and finally, fractures and civil war. Let's get into it. Starting with Part 1, Weapons of the Pen, Anti-Colonial Journalism in West Africa. Let's look at how the printing press literally became the chief artillery against colonial rule. Because in the absence of formal political parties back in the early 20th century, newspapers were the primary vehicle for public opinion and political pressure in West Africa. And this perfectly illustrates the two journalistic generals of the era. Their distinct styles completely shaped public consciousness. On one side, we have Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, or Zik, who founded the West African Pilot in 1937. He went for this bold, sensational Pan-African approach, completely changing the game by introducing large banner headlines and a punchy one-sentence-per-paragraph style. Then, stepping up to challenge that dominance, you've got Chief Obafemi Awolowo. He set up the Nigerian Tribune in 1949 with what he called a pungent pen. It was fiercely anti-colonial, totally combative, and didn't care whose feathers it ruffled, though it was definitely more focused on his native Yoruba region. Now, what's genuinely fascinating is how these editors acted as these incredibly powerful gatekeepers. They weren't just reporting the news, they were actively creating a politically conscious public. By throwing in interactive stuff like letters to the editor, gossip columns, and human interest stories, they completely transformed everyday readers, clerks, teachers, rural farmers, into active participants in the struggle for self-governance. They were out there exposing colonial hypocrisy on a daily basis, making these newspapers an absolute must-read companion for the people. But look, to build a nation, you need more than just newspapers complaining about what's wrong, right? You need a real philosophical framework. Which brings us to Section 2, the ideology of Zikontism and decolonizing the African mind. Formulated by Azikiwe, these 5 canons were specifically designed to systematically decolonize young African minds. Think of it as a step-by-step blueprint. You've got spiritual balance, which was all about cultivating respect for other people's opinions. Social regeneration demanded the total jettisoning of ethnic, tribal, and racial prejudice. Then economic determinism argued, pretty practically, that political freedom meant absolutely nothing without economic self-sufficiency. And all of this was meant to lead to political resurgence, essentially the total rebirth of the African state. Let's really zoom in on this specific canon, mental emancipation, because honestly, undoing the psychological damage of colonial rule is a deeply relevant battle against neocolonialism even today. Zik argued that the slave trade and colonization had created this massive crisis of self-confidence. He pushed for Africans to adopt the Socratic principle, man, know yourself. He was teaching that there was literally zero scientific proof of racial superiority and that Africans basically had to wake up, shed that inferiority complex, and realize their own inherent power. Okay, so we have the media and we have the philosophy, but now we need the actual organization on the ground. Section 3, Forging a Political Movement, from the printing press to the party. Let's trace how this momentum builds. It was propelled by the outrage from events like the 1941 King's College student strikes. Imagine boarding students protesting poor conditions, getting expelled, and even conscripted into military service.
That made a unified national front absolutely necessary. So Azikiwe's momentum shifts. He goes from publishing the pilot in 1937 to becoming the general secretary of the newly formed NCNC party in 1944. And that drive keeps pushing all the way to independence in 1960, with him ultimately becoming president of the Republic in 1963.
The methodology for this whole transition was incredibly clear and super effective. First, use the mass media to wake up the populace. Second, don't just ask individuals to join the party. They actually merged over 300 existing regional, tribal, and trade unions into one massive national council. And third, use that massive, unified coalition to push relentlessly for sovereignty. Which leads us to Section 4, the First Republic. A sovereign Nigeria is realized. By 1960, the dream actually came true. British rule officially ended, and by 1963, Nigeria was a fully independent republic, with Azikiwe serving as its very first president. The pen had legitimately defeated the sword of colonialism. But as we all know, campaigning is one thing. Governing is a completely different beast. To manage a newly independent nation made up of over 400 distinct ethnic and linguistic groups, the founders had to attempt this incredibly delicate, almost paradoxical, federal balancing act. Just as Zikism proposed, they had to grant each region de jure equality, meaning equal legal standing and autonomy for all local authorities, while at the same time openly acknowledging de facto inequality. They couldn't ignore the reality that these regions had vastly different populations, land masses, and natural resources. So, right in the middle of all the celebrations of sovereignty, with the new green and white flag flying high, a very sobering reality was looming over the leadership. Could this carefully constructed yet incredibly fragile political union actually survive its own internal divisions? Could the reality of tribalism be adapted to create true national unity? This brings us to Section 5, Fractures and Civil War, the collapse of the First Republic. Unfortunately, the structural cracks in that foundation soon became impossible to ignore. The exact same regionalism that allowed these incredibly diverse groups to unite against the British started to turn inward the moment the common enemy was gone. When we look closely at how it unravels, it's a pretty heartbreaking reality. It wasn't just simple ethnic differences that caused the breakdown. The sources point clearly to elite greed, extreme political self-interest, and the absolute failure of political parties to rise above tribalism. Instead of fostering the national unity that leaders like Azikiwe and Oluowo originally envisioned, politicians just started exploiting ethnic differences to secure regional power and resources for themselves, completely eroding the federal structure. And these overwhelming pressures tragically culminated in the very first military coup and the complete collapse of the First Republic on January 15, 1966. This massive implosion, happening just a few short years after the joy of independence, plunged the newly formed nation right into a devastating civil war, one that would alter its history and its political landscape forever. What the history really reveals here is that the underlying driver of the conflict was way less about inherent geographical differences and so much more about structural inequality. I mean, whether you were a farmer in the north or a worker in the south, your daily challenges of poverty and inequality were identical. It was elite political self-interest that actually tore the federal system apart. They weaponized ethnic identity to mask their own failure in providing equitable governance. So, moving to our conclusion, the lasting legacy of the founders. What should you actually take away from this explainer today? How in the world do we reconcile the brilliant intellectual founding of Nigeria with its incredibly turbulent early years? Well, the pen and the mind absolutely succeeded in dismantling the colonial state. The sheer force of journalistic activism, combined with philosophical frameworks like Zikonism, literally gave Nigerians the tools they needed for mental emancipation. But the political architects ultimately struggled to stop the resulting nation from fracturing under the immense weight of regionalism and inequality. And honestly, the tension we see right here between trying to build a unified national identity while preserving local ethnic interests, that's a balancing act that almost every modern democracy is still trying to figure out today. I want to leave you with Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe's timeless journalistic motto for the West African pilot. He said, "Show the light and the people will find the way." It's such a powerful reminder that the pursuit of truth, education, and civic engagement is still the absolute most critical tool for any nation's future. The founders lit a spark that created a sovereign nation. So, looking at the complex challenges in our own societies today,
What lights will you choose to follow? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.